When the crime scene investigators first arrived, they had to pause several times, unable to continue with their examination. You might think you've seen it all in movies, but nothing, and I mean nothing, prepares you for what happened here. Grace Holloway was only 17 years old, but she had an old soul. Her world was simple. She trusted everyone, she believed the best in people, and she was incredibly close to her mother, Elaine. They were inseparable. Grace, with her long brown hair, always wearing that innocent smile, seemed like the type of person who would never get caught up in anything dark. She volunteered at animal shelters, helping every creature she could find, from injured birds to stray dogs. Her mother always said Grace was the heart of their family. But nothing prepares you for the person who enters your life when you least expect it. Grace had no idea when she offered to tutor Ethan Vale, an 18-year-old classmate with a troubled history, that it would mark the beginning of a nightmare. Ethan appeared to be another misunderstood student, struggling academically, but he hid a darkness under his seemingly charming exterior. For Grace, offering help was second nature. She didn't think twice. But a few days later, she would vanish without a trace. The search for Grace lasted 24 long hours. When her body was found, deep in the fog-covered forest by Hunter's Bridge, even the seasoned investigators were shaken by what they uncovered. What was done to her? The details are so disturbing they still haunt the team to this day. But the real shock came when they retrieved Ethan's journals, and found chilling notes that gave insight into his twisted mind. It turns out Ethan's manipulation of Grace wasn't driven by affection or love. No, it was far worse than that. He wasn't trying to win her over. He was trying to break her down, strip away everything that made her pure. One of the most chilling entries he wrote, and one that police would later focus on, said, "Destroy innocence. Break the bond. That makes me whole." And the most horrifying part? Grace had never been his target because of who she was. She was chosen because she was the easiest person to trust. If this story is already sending chills down your spine, make sure to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss out on any more chilling true crime stories like this one. Trust me, you'll want to stay with us until the end. Now let me take you back to the beginning. Before the search, before the chilling journals, before Grace's life was torn apart. It all started with a simple act of kindness. Grace never could have known what that simple act would lead to. Let me take you back to the beginning. Before the search, before the chilling journals, before Grace's life was torn apart. It all started with a simple act of kindness. Grace never could have known what that simple act would lead to. The fog that rolled into Marion Ridge wasn't the only thing that was opaque in that small, seemingly perfect town. Ethan Vale had always existed in the periphery of Grace Holloway's life, someone she barely noticed at first. To her, he was just another classmate, a face in the crowd. But for Ethan, Grace wasn't just another girl. She was an experiment. And experiments, when they're successful, yield results. It wasn't affection he sought, but domination, the kind of control he'd never had in his own fractured life. Ethan had a history of trouble. That's how most people in Marion Ridge knew him, if they knew him at all. The quiet, slightly off-kilter kid who kept to himself, or so it seemed. His trouble started in grade school, where he had been known to lash out at classmates who irritated him, his anger barely contained behind dark eyes that seemed always to be calculating, always watching. He was never one for sports or social clubs, preferring instead to sit alone, lost in his own thoughts. The few teachers who knew Ethan well enough described him as a boy who understood the rules but chose not to follow them. His misbehavior was always just on the edge, an isolated incident here, a defiant act there, small enough to dismiss but big enough to raise suspicion. As he grew older, Ethan's behavior escalated. By the time he was 16, his school records were peppered with notes about behavioral issues, but they never truly got the attention they deserved. He was often sent to the principal's office for outbursts or for disturbing the class, and his behavior became increasingly aggressive. By then, the quiet boy no one understood had started to reveal a darker side of himself, one that few cared to look at. It wasn't just that he had anger problems, it was that he had learned to channel those emotions into a quiet, deliberate manipulation. In the deep recesses of his mind, Ethan believed that love was weakness. Attachment to him was a flaw. It made people vulnerable, and that vulnerability could be exploited. Ethan spent hours online reading philosophy, or rather, his warped interpretation of it. He'd stumbled upon ideas that argued love was nothing more than a chemical reaction in the brain, an illusion of necessity that masked the raw truth. People didn't need each other. They could be controlled. They could be isolated. They could be made to believe whatever you wanted. And that, to him, was the ultimate power. In his mind, the idea of love was for fools, people who didn't understand that dominance, control, was everything. Ethan didn't need affection. He needed power. It was only when he found Grace that his experiment truly began. Grace wasn't just any girl. She was the ideal subject. She trusted people with an innocence so pure that it made Ethan feel something foreign, something that resembled admiration, but it was quickly overshadowed by his desire to break her. He didn't want her affection. No, Ethan's mind was consumed with making her believe that he was the only person who could help her, the only one who understood. He watched her every move, studied her like a lab rat in an experiment. He knew what made her smile. He knew what made her nervous. The way her eyes would widen when someone gave her a compliment, or the way she fidgeted with her bracelet when she was anxious. He could see it all. Grace's kindness was her greatest strength, but also her greatest weakness. Ethan wasn't interested in being her friend. He didn't want to be the boy she turned to for comfort. No, Ethan wanted control over her, to strip away her independence and make her reliant on him, her only source of safety. Every word he said to her was crafted with precision, designed to make her question everything around her, especially her relationship with her mother. At first, Grace didn't realize what Ethan was doing. He was kind, seemingly interested in the things she loved. He'd pretend to care about her volunteer work, her passion for nursing, and her love of animals. She thought of him as a friend. She never suspected the dark intentions behind his words. And when she invited him to meet her mother, Elaine, she thought it would help solidify their friendship. Grace had always believed in the best in people. Even Ethan, who had a way of making her feel understood. But Ethan wasn't the friend he pretended to be. Around Elaine he was cold and dismissive. He'd throw back his shoulders, give Elaine curt answers, and avoid eye contact. He never smiled at her, never showed the warmth that Grace had hoped for. Elaine, ever the protective mother, began to notice the subtle tension when Ethan was around. It wasn't something she could place at first, but she felt it, the way he made Grace seem so much smaller in comparison. The way his comments had an edge, as if he were slowly trying to pull Grace away bit by bit, until she would be entirely his. Grace started changing. She became more withdrawn. Her once lively conversations with her mother turned into silence. It wasn't that Grace didn't want to talk, it was that she began to believe that there was something wrong with her for needing her mother so much. She'd cancel plans with Elaine, saying she had other things to do, other people to see. And when she did speak, it was often about how she felt too dependent on her mother. It was a strange, unfamiliar language for Elaine. She hadn't raised her daughter to be so distant, to believe she needed to cut ties with the person who had always been there for her. "I think I'm just too attached to you, Mom," Grace would say, her voice soft and uncertain. "I need to figure out how to be okay on my own." It didn't take long for Elaine to understand that these were not Grace's words. They were Ethan's. Ethan had carefully planted them in Grace's mind. Every time they spoke, he would tell her how her mother was holding her back. How she would never truly be happy until she learned to break free of Elaine's control. Ethan wasn't just manipulating Grace, he was isolating her from her own source of strength. And as much as Elaine tried to warn Grace to gently pull her back, the more Grace believed that her mother was the obstacle. Elaine's voice, once a steady reassurance, now seemed like the problem in Grace's eyes. Ethan had successfully poisoned her mind. But the tension finally reached its breaking point when Elaine overheard a conversation between the two. Grace and Ethan had been talking in the living room, their voices low. Elaine was in the kitchen, cleaning the counter, when she caught a snippet of their exchange. "Your mother doesn't think you can survive without her," Ethan's voice was soft but cutting. "She's holding you back from everything you want." Elaine's heart sank. She stepped closer, trying to make sense of what she had heard, but her worst fears were confirmed. Ethan wasn't just talking to Grace. He was eroding the very foundation of their relationship. Elaine's instincts kicked in. She stormed into the living room, confronting Ethan with a fury she had never known. "What are you doing to my daughter?" she demanded, her voice shaking with rage. Ethan's expression was cold, unmoving. But inside, he felt a strange satisfaction, like a predator that had finally cornered its prey. He smiled, and for the first time, Elaine felt the full weight of the boy she was facing. Not fear, but something darker. A quiet triumph that chilled her to the core. And in that moment, Elaine knew, the worst had only just begun. The sun had barely risen over Marion Ridge that cold winter morning, casting a soft, muted glow on the sleepy town. But inside the Holloway household, the warmth of the early hours quickly gave way to tension. It had started with a seemingly insignificant argument, just a few words really, but those words were carefully planted. Ethan had done his work well. Grace, already under his manipulative influence, had grown restless. The more time she spent with him, the more she began to question everything she knew. And it had come to a head that morning. "You don't get it, Mom? You're smothering me," Grace had said, her voice trembling but firm. Elaine had been blindsided by her daughter's words. For months now, she had sensed a growing distance between them, but this wasn't like Grace. "Smothering? Grace, I'm trying to protect you. I love you," Elaine had pleaded, but her voice was small, strained. She didn't know what had happened to her sweet daughter, the one who always sought comfort in her arms. "I just need some space," Grace snapped. "I need to think for myself." The pain in Elaine's chest was nearly unbearable as she watched Grace walk away, slamming her bedroom door. It was the same argument they'd had for the past few weeks, only this time, Grace didn't seem to be listening. Elaine stood frozen for a moment, staring at the closed door, wondering when things had started slipping away. When had her daughter, her precious Grace, stopped being the open-hearted girl who loved her more than anything? And who was this cold, distant person now standing in her place? Ethan's influence had become insidious. Every word, every suggestion he planted in Grace's mind had taken root. But Elaine didn't know that yet. All she knew was that something was terribly wrong. After a long, quiet breakfast, Grace told her mother she was heading out to clear her head, to meet a friend. Elaine's heart tightened. "Oh, where are you going?" Grace hesitated, her eyes flickering with uncertainty. "I'll be fine, Mom. I just need to get away for a while." Elaine's instincts screamed at her to stop her, to hold on to her daughter. But Grace was already slipping away, pulling her arms further from Elaine's reach. "Call me when you're back, okay?" Elaine said, trying to hold back the tears that threatened to spill. But Grace, already at the door, simply nodded. "I will." The door clicked shut behind her and Elaine's unease deepened. It wasn't like Grace to be so elusive, so distant. Still, she tried to shake off the gnawing feeling in her stomach. She had to trust Grace, she had to believe that everything would be fine. The morning stretched into the afternoon and still, Grace hadn't returned. Elaine busied herself with chores around the house, but every few minutes she found herself glancing at the clock, her anxiety growing. By 3 p.m. the call started. First, she dialed Grace's number, but the phone went straight to voicemail. Unusual. Grace never turned her phone off. Elaine called again. No answer. Then again. Still nothing. A cold chill crept up her spine. Something was wrong. She could feel it in her bones. Elaine tried not to panic. Maybe Grace had just gone for a walk, or maybe she was with a friend and had forgotten to charge her phone. But the uncertainty gnawed at her. At 4:30 p.m. Elaine made the call. The one she never wanted to make. The missing persons report was filed. It took less than an hour for the town to mobilize. Marion Ridge was small, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else. People gathered in clusters, asking questions, trying to figure out where Grace could have gone. Elaine's worst fears were coming to life. Her daughter, the girl who had never stayed out past curfew, the girl who was so full of life, was now missing. At first, there were small search parties, a few neighbors, some volunteers who knew Elaine and Grace, spreading out across the town. As hours passed, the search grew. Local law enforcement arrived, organizing teams, reaching out to the media. The local news quickly picked up the story. The streets of Marion Ridge were no longer peaceful, no longer quiet. Police cars dotted the corners, and sirens rang through the town like a sickening reminder that things had taken a darker turn. Meanwhile, Ethan acted strangely calm. At school the next day, he joked around with his friends as though nothing was amiss. His classmates, looking back, would later report his bizarre behavior. How he smiled too much, how he seemed oddly unaffected by the news that one of his peers was missing. If anyone had suspected Ethan, they didn't say a word. But inside, Ethan was calculating as always. He knew exactly where Grace was, or at least he knew what he'd done. It was all part of his plan. His manipulation had led them both here. To this moment. It wasn't until the following day that the discovery was made. A group of hikers, taking their usual walk through the fog-covered forest that blanketed the area around Hunter's Bridge, had stumbled upon something they never expected to see. The body of a young woman, lifeless and cold, lying in the brush, hidden beneath the fallen leaves. The hikers had recoiled in shock, their hearts pounding in fear. They quickly called the police, who were on the scene within minutes. The forensic team arrived, their faces grim, but even they couldn't prepare for what lay before them. It was hard to identify the body at first. The cold had taken its toll and the damage was severe. But as the team methodically examined the scene, they found one thing that didn't belong: Grace's charm bracelet. Elaine, when the call came, thought it was a mistake. How could they know? How could they have possibly found her so quickly? It was impossible. When she was told, Elaine collapsed, her world crumbling beneath her. There was no hope left. Her daughter, the girl she had tried so desperately to protect, was gone. And in her place was a nightmare, one she would never escape. As the forensic team continued their investigation, the town of Marion Ridge began to change. The shockwaves from Grace's death rippled through every corner of the town. The quiet, peaceful community where nothing bad was ever supposed to happen was now forever marked by the horror that had unfolded. People locked their doors at night, double-checked their windows, and whispered in hushed tones about the evil that had touched their lives. But the biggest question still loomed large: who had done this to Grace? And why? The police investigation was only beginning. They had only just started to peel back the layers of this horrific crime. But for now, the truth remained elusive, hidden in the fog of the forest, just out of reach. And as the town waited for answers, one thing was clear: whoever had done this, whoever had taken Grace's life, was still out there. And they weren't done yet. The world outside Marion Ridge was still reeling from the loss of Grace Holloway. The town, which had once prided itself on its quiet, peaceful streets, was now a community haunted by a terrible secret. But for the detectives on the case, the search for answers was only just beginning. As they pored over the evidence gathered from the crime scene, one thing stood out: Ethan Vale. When Grace's body was discovered at Hunter's Bridge, Ethan became an immediate person of interest. His strange behavior in the days following her disappearance raised enough red flags to warrant a closer look. He had been the last one to speak with Grace, and there were questions surrounding his role in her life that couldn't be ignored. It didn't take long for investigators to secure a warrant for Ethan's phone and computer. They needed to know more, to understand how deep this twisted relationship had gone. The first breakthrough came quickly. Grace's last phone call wasn't to her mother, Elaine. It was to Ethan. The phone records were clear. Grace had called Ethan at 11:46 a.m., just hours before she disappeared. The call lasted for over 6 minutes. It wasn't a casual conversation. This wasn't a simple check-in between friends. The timing was chilling. Grace, the girl who had always kept her mother close, had chosen to speak to Ethan in her final moments, not Elaine. The police were already growing suspicious. Why had Grace turned to Ethan in that critical moment? What had they discussed? Why hadn't she reached out to her mother, especially when she knew how deeply Elaine cared for her? The detectives dug deeper into Ethan's phone logs, but there was nothing overtly alarming, just an ordinary, seemingly benign list of messages with friends, including Grace. However, one thing stuck out: Ethan's strange calmness in the days following Grace's disappearance. Ethan's first interrogation took place a few days after Grace was found. He sat across from Detective Taylor, his eyes shifting around the room, his body posture stiff but not defensive. He seemed calm, too calm for someone whose classmate had been murdered. His expression was unreadable, like a mask he wore to hide whatever lay beneath. "I barely knew Grace," Ethan said, his voice soft but steady. "She seemed troubled. She had problems at home and she'd mentioned running away before. She just wanted to get away from everything. I was just trying to help her." The words felt rehearsed, like he had practiced them 1,000 times in front of a mirror. His claim that Grace had been troubled didn't align with the Grace everyone knew, the sweet, innocent girl who had always been open and kind, not the type to suddenly lash out or plan to disappear. Detective Taylor leaned forward, trying to catch a flicker of emotion in Ethan's cold demeanor. "And what exactly did you talk about on that last call?" he asked, keeping his voice measured. Ethan's eyes shifted, but he quickly composed himself. "We just talked about how she was feeling. I told her that if she ever needed someone to talk to, I'd be there." It was the perfect answer, the kind of response someone would expect from a concerned friend who was looking to appear helpful. But there was something in his delivery that didn't sit right with the detectives. Ethan wasn't grieving, wasn't showing any sign of being emotionally affected by the loss. Instead, he seemed to be playing a part, a role that didn't match the gravity of the situation. The next day, a team of officers arrived at Ethan's house with a search warrant for his laptop. They knew this was where the real answers lay. If Ethan had truly been the last person to speak to Grace, then surely the digital trail would tell a story, one that could either confirm or tear apart his alibi. Hours passed as the forensic team scoured through Ethan's files. And then they found it. In a hidden folder buried deep within his system were a series of journal entries. These were no ordinary notes. They were a detailed, chilling roadmap of Ethan's manipulation of Grace, a diary of his descent into obsession. The journals chronicled his every move, his every plan. They read like a twisted manifesto with one repeated theme: control. The The first entry was dated 2 months before Grace's disappearance. Step 1. Build trust. Let her think she's helping me. Let her believe that I'm a lost cause. She'll want to fix me. She'll want to be my savior. The following entries detailed how Ethan had studied Grace. He took meticulous notes on what made her tick, what made her smile, what made her nervous, how she reacted to kindness, and how she reacted to criticism. Every move she made was analyzed. Every word she said was dissected. Ethan wasn't in this for love, as he had so cleverly told Grace. He was in it for something far darker. He wanted to dominate, to break her, not because he cared, but because he wanted to prove that love, kindness, and innocence could all be shattered. Step 3. Isolate. Convince her that her mother is the obstacle. Make her believe that she's too dependent. Make her feel like she needs me, not her family. This is where I take control. And there it was. The entire plan laid out in black and white. Ethan's manipulation had been years in the making. His obsession with breaking the bond between Grace and her mother was systematic, like an artist crafting a masterpiece, one that would leave nothing but destruction in its wake. The line that haunted the investigators, though, was the one that encapsulated it all. Destroy innocence. Break the bond. That makes me whole. The detectives had to pause as they read these words. The magnitude of what they were seeing was unbearable. Some of them left the room, unable to continue. The emotional toll of reading Ethan's journals was too much. Even hardened officers were shaken to their core by the coldness, the methodical cruelty, that poured from each page. Ethan was arrested that night, his expression unchanged, his demeanor still eerily calm. He sat in the interrogation room, his hands resting lightly on the table in front of him, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his lips. Detective Taylor walked in, the weight of the evidence pressing down on him. Ethan had already confessed in his journals, but they needed the words from him, the final admission. Why, Ethan? Taylor asked, his voice strained. Why did you do it? Ethan's smile didn't falter. His eyes glinted with a strange satisfaction as he leaned back in his chair, his voice low but steady. To prove that love is the easiest thing in the world to break. It was a chilling answer, one that sent a cold shiver down the detective's spine. Ethan wasn't sorry. He didn't feel remorse. In his mind he had achieved his goal. Grace had been a perfect specimen, a pure, innocent girl who had trusted too easily. And now she was broken. As the door to the interview room clicked shut behind Ethan, the finality of it all sank in. The cold, calculated nature of his actions was more terrifying than any of them had imagined. But the story wasn't over. Not yet. Ethan's arrest was just the beginning of a long, drawn-out process, one that would expose even more of his twisted mind, and one that would forever change the lives of everyone involved. For Grace's mother, Elaine, the fight for justice had only just begun. The courtroom was packed. Every seat was filled with spectators, families, friends, law enforcement, and reporters. Marion Ridge, a town that once seemed as innocent as its rolling hills and quaint streets, now found itself in the harsh glare of national headlines. Grace Holloway's murder had captured the attention of the entire country, but for the Holloway family, the spotlight only made their pain more unbearable. Elaine sat in the front row, her face pale and drawn. She was surrounded by a few of Grace's closest friends and relatives, all of whom were trying to hold it together. There was an almost oppressive silence in the room, broken only by the sound of shuffle of papers, the quiet hum of whispered conversations, and the occasional cough from the audience. Ethan sat at the defense table, his hands folded neatly in front of him, looking like a boy who had been caught in a game far bigger than he ever intended to play. His expression was impassive, his eyes empty of emotion. To the casual observer, it would have appeared that Ethan was taking this all in stride. He wasn't the least bit nervous. In fact, he seemed oddly detached from the weight of the moment. To him, this was just another performance, another show to put on display, and he was going to play his part with unsettling precision. As the hearing began, the prosecutors stood tall, presenting their evidence methodically. Every item revealed in the courtroom felt like a gut punch to those who had lived through the horror of Grace's death. They started with the digital timeline. The records from Grace's phone, Ethan's laptop, and all the communications between the two were laid bare for the world to see. The messages, the long drawn-out manipulation, everything was there in black and white. It wasn't just the phone calls or text messages that spoke volumes, though. The prosecutors displayed the journal entries Ethan had meticulously crafted over the months of his torment. Pages and pages of his twisted thoughts, how he had methodically planned every interaction with Grace, every word he had planted in her head. The journal entries were nothing short of chilling. The most haunting entry, however, came at the end. Destroy innocence. Break the bond. That makes me whole. Those words reverberated through the courtroom, leaving the air thick with an unsettling weight. And then the tapes. The recordings of Grace's last moments. Her voice, desperate and unsure, reaching out for help. The recording of Ethan's voice, cold and detached, instructing her to believe that everything she thought was real was nothing more than a lie. Her final message to him was simple, almost heartbreaking. I don't know who to trust anymore. Elaine buried her face in her hands when the tape played. Every word, every emotion from her daughter, it was like hearing Grace's voice for the first time in forever, but this time, it wasn't full of life and laughter. This time it was full of fear. The thought that her daughter had felt alone in that moment, that she had been manipulated into trusting the very person who would destroy her, was more than Elaine could bear. The courtroom was silent, save for the soft sobs of those who couldn't hold their emotions in any longer. And then it was Elaine's turn to speak. The moment everyone had been waiting for. She had written the statement herself, pouring her heart into every word, each sentence an expression of her deepest grief and her desperate wish to have just one more moment with her daughter. As Elaine stood before the judge, she seemed like a ghost of the woman she used to be, pale, trembling, and heartbroken. Her hands gripped the edges of the lectern, and she took a deep breath, steadying herself before reading the words that would haunt Ethan for the rest of his life. I don't know how to explain what it feels like to lose a child, to lose the very person you raised and loved every single day. Grace was my light, my reason for everything. And now she's gone. And it's because of you. You stole my daughter. You took away the person who trusted you, who believed in you. My daughter trusted the wrong person, and now my life will never be the same. Every day, I wake up and wonder what happened to the girl who used to laugh with me, who would sit beside me and tell me everything. I'll never get those moments back. And I'll never stop loving her, but I'll never be whole again. Not without her. The words hung in the air, each one landing like a heavy blow. The room was silent, save for the quiet sniffling of the people around Elaine. It was impossible to ignore the pain in her voice. Then the judge spoke. His voice was firm but filled with an undeniable sorrow. You didn't destroy innocence. You destroyed yourself. You will never walk freely again. It was a moment that would be remembered forever in Marion Ridge. Those words felt like justice, like the final closure that Elaine and Grace's family had longed for. Ethan was sentenced to life in prison with no chance of parole for at least 25 years. But it didn't feel like enough. How could it? How could any punishment restore what had been taken? Ethan's face remained impassive as the sentence was handed down. He didn't flinch, didn't show an ounce of remorse. His eyes were cold, distant, as if the entire trial had been nothing more than a passing inconvenience. As the courtroom cleared, Elaine found herself in a fog. The weight of the past few days, the shock, the pain, it was all still there, lingering like a dark cloud hanging over her head. She didn't feel relieved. She didn't feel closure. All she felt was the deep, unyielding void that had once been filled by her daughter. The trial was over, but the healing would never come. Marion Ridge, a town that once felt safe and unbreakable, was forever changed. Parents began locking their doors at night. Children became more guarded, more suspicious. The simple, trusting life they once led now seemed impossible, a world that was no longer safe. The crime had taken more than Grace. It had taken the innocence of a community. Elaine visited Grace's memorial weekly. She couldn't bear the thought of forgetting her daughter, even for a moment. Every week, she stood there, alone in front of the flowers and the small statue of an angel, holding on to the last piece of Grace she had left. Sometimes, she would just sit there for hours, her fingers gently tracing the words on Grace's headstone. She kept Grace's charm bracelet in a small box beside her bed. Each night, before going to sleep, Elaine would hold it in her hands, the cold metal of the bracelet a painful reminder of what she had lost. It was the only piece of Grace she could still touch, the only part of her that wasn't taken away. The town, once full of hope, had become a place of vigilance. But for Elaine, the battle wasn't over. She started speaking out about teenage isolation, manipulation, and how vulnerable young people could be to those who understood how to prey on their weaknesses. Grace's story became her fight. She began advocating for awareness and education on emotional manipulation, hoping that, somehow, her daughter's life could help protect others from falling victim to the same fate. If you were moved by Grace's story, please take a moment to subscribe to True Crime Files. Every story we share is an opportunity to learn, to stay aware, and to protect those around us. Don't forget to hit the notification bell so you never miss another investigation into the darker truths hidden in plain sight. Share this video with others to spread awareness, and leave a comment to let us know what you think. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Thank you for joining us today, and remember, the most dangerous people aren't always the ones we fear the most. Sometimes they're the ones we trust the most. Stay safe and take care of each other.